Every day, you're playing strategic games without realizing it, negotiating a salary, deciding whether to cooperate or compete with a colleague, figuring out how to discipline your kids, choosing when to reveal information and when to hold back. These aren't just random interactions. They're strategic situations where your success depends on anticipating what others will do and acting accordingly. Today, we're exploring The Art of Strategy by Avinash K. Dixit and Barry J. Nailbuff, two Yale professors who've spent decades studying game theory, the science of strategic thinking. This book translates complex mathematical concepts into practical wisdom you can apply to business negotiations, competitive situations, personal relationships, and everyday decisions. What makes this book powerful is that it doesn't just give you tips or tactics. It teaches you how to think strategically, to see the hidden structure beneath surface interactions, to anticipate others' moves by understanding their incentives, to recognize when cooperation serves you better than competition, and to make decisions that account for how others will respond to your actions. Game theory sounds academic, but it's intensely practical. Companies use it to outmaneuver competitors. Negotiators use it to get better deals. Parents use it to get kids to cooperate. Nations use it to navigate diplomacy. Once you understand the principles, you see strategic games everywhere, and you start playing them better. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll explore the core principles of strategic thinking, how to look ahead and reason backward to make better decisions, understanding dominant strategies and Nash equilibrium, the power of commitment and credibility, when to cooperate and when to compete, how to use information strategically, managing timing and sequence in competitive situations, and applying these principles to real-world scenarios in business and life. If you've ever felt outmaneuvered in negotiations, if you want to make better strategic decisions in competitive situations, if you're curious about the hidden logic that determines who wins and loses in strategic interactions, or if you simply want to think more clearly about how to achieve your goals when success depends on what others do, this is your guide. Let's master the art of strategy. Part 1. Thinking strategically. Look ahead and reason backward. Dixit and Nailbuff open with the fundamental principle of strategic thinking. Look ahead and reason backward. Most people think one step ahead. If I do this, what happens? Strategic thinkers think multiple steps ahead. If I do this, what will they do? Then what will I do? Then what will they do? And work backward to determine the best first move. The authors illustrate with a simple example: the game of tic-tac-toe. Children play without strategy, placing marks randomly. But once you think ahead to all possible outcomes and reason backward, you realize the game always ends in a draw if both players play optimally. The first player can never win against an opponent who looks ahead. This insight, that looking ahead reveals which strategies work, applies to far more complex situations. In business, looking ahead and reasoning backward transforms decision-making. Should you enter a market where a dominant competitor exists? Look ahead. If you enter, how will they respond? Will they cut prices, increase marketing, or innovate? Given their likely response, will your entry be profitable? If the answer is no, don't enter. This saves resources and prevents predictable failures. The authors provide a framework called the game tree, mapping out all possible moves and countermoves as branches on a tree. At each decision point, You identify available actions. For each action, you project others' likely responses. For each response, you project your counter-response. Following branches to their endpoints reveals which initial actions lead to favorable outcomes. This process reveals that many tempting moves lead nowhere. You might want to aggressively cut prices to gain market share. But looking ahead shows competitors will match your cuts, erasing your advantage while everyone's margins suffer. Reasoning backward, you realize price cutting is futile, so you compete on other dimensions instead. Dixit and Nailabov emphasize that reasoning backward requires understanding others' incentives and constraints. You can't predict moves without understanding what others want and what options they have. The chess player who understands their opponent's position can anticipate moves. The player who doesn't is constantly surprised. The authors address the difference between sequential games, players take turns, and simultaneous games, players move at the same time without knowing others' choices. Sequential games allow looking ahead and reasoning backward because you can see previous moves before deciding. Simultaneous games require different strategies because you must guess what others will do without seeing their actions first. For sequential games, the key is sub-game perfect equilibrium, finding the strategy that's optimal not just at the start, but at every decision point throughout the game. This requires analyzing the game from end to beginning, determining optimal play at each stage. A classic example is the ultimatum game. One person divides money between themselves and another person who can accept or reject the split. If they reject, neither gets anything. Looking ahead and reasoning backward reveals the optimal strategy. The first player should offer the minimum amount the second player might accept, because rejecting means getting nothing. But this theoretical optimum often fails in practice because it ignores psychology. People reject unfair offers, even at cost to themselves. This highlights that strategic thinking must account for human behavior, not just mathematical logic. Dixit and Nailabov provide practical applications. In negotiations, looking ahead means anticipating how the other side will respond to your offer. If you make an extreme demand, will they walk away? If you make a moderate offer, will they exploit your reasonableness by asking for more? Reasoning backward from likely responses determines your optimal opening position. In career decisions, looking ahead means projecting how choices cascade into future options. Taking a high-paying job that doesn't build skills may look attractive immediately, but reasoning backward from your 10-year goal reveals it's a strategic error. Taking a lower-paying job that develops valuable skills positions you better long-term. The chapter concludes with the author's insight that most people don't think ahead systematically. They react to immediate situations without projecting consequences. This creates opportunities for strategic thinkers who do look ahead and reason backward. In any competitive situation, the person thinking more steps ahead usually wins. Part 2. Dominant Strategies and Nash Equilibrium. Dixit and Nailabov introduce two fundamental concepts from game theory: dominant strategies and Nash equilibrium. Understanding these reveals why certain outcomes occur repeatedly across different situations and how to position yourself advantageously. A dominant strategy is an action that's best for you regardless of what others do. If you have a dominant strategy, the decision is simple: do it. The challenge is identifying whether you have one, and if you don't, understanding why and what to do instead. The authors illustrate with the classic prisoner's dilemma. Two suspects are arrested and interrogated separately. Each can either cooperate with the other, stay silent, or defect, betray the other. If both stay silent, both get light sentences. If one betrays while the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free while the other gets a heavy sentence. If both betray, both get moderate sentences. From each prisoner's perspective, betraying is a dominant strategy. If the other stays silent, betraying gets you freedom instead of a light sentence. Better. If the other betrays, betraying gets you a moderate sentence instead of a heavy sentence. Better. Betraying is better regardless of what the other does, so both betray. Both get moderate sentences, even though both would be better off if both had stayed silent. This dilemma appears everywhere. Companies competing on price face the same structure. Cutting prices is a dominant strategy. If competitors cut, you must cut to stay competitive. If they don't cut, you gain market share by cutting. So everyone cuts, everyone's margins shrink, and all companies are worse off than if everyone had maintained prices. Understanding this structure explains why price wars happen and why they're so destructive. Dixit and Nailabuff explain that the prisoner's dilemma reveals when cooperation is difficult. When individuals have dominant strategies that harm collective welfare, cooperation requires either changing the structure through binding agreements or repeated interaction, where future consequences affect current choices. Nash equilibrium, named after mathematician John Nash, describes situations where each player's strategy is optimal given others' strategies. No one can improve their outcome by unilaterally changing strategy. Nash equilibrium doesn't require dominant strategies. It just requires mutual best responses. Many strategic situations have multiple Nash equilibria. Driving on the right versus left side of the road are both equilibria. Neither is inherently better, but everyone must coordinate. Once an equilibrium is established, deviating harms you even if the alternative equilibrium would be equally good. The authors explain that Nash equilibrium predicts behavior when players think strategically. If a situation has a unique Nash equilibrium, sophisticated players will reach it. If multiple equilibria exist, the challenge is coordinating on which one. This is where communication, tradition, and focal points matter. Dixit and Nailabuff address the gap between Nash equilibrium predictions and actual behavior. Pure game theory assumes perfect rationality and common knowledge. Everyone knows everyone is rational. Everyone knows everyone knows everyone is rational, and so on. Real humans aren't perfectly rational and don't have common knowledge. So predictions don't always hold. This creates opportunities. If you understand game theory better than others, you can exploit their predictable irrationality. In negotiations, people often make offers worse than their Nash equilibrium could support because they don't think through the full strategic structure. Understanding where equilibrium lies gives you an advantage. The authors provide business applications. In oligopoly markets with few competitors, Nash equilibrium explains how prices settle. Each firm sets prices anticipating competitors' prices, and equilibrium occurs when no firm wants to change, given others' prices. Understanding this structure helps predict competitor behavior and set your own strategy. In talent competitions, sports drafts, recruiting, Nash equilibrium explains why teams overpay. Each team must bid enough to win talent, given what others will bid, driving up prices to the point where winning barely makes sense. Recognizing this structure helps avoid winner's curse, winning bids that turn out to be losses. Dixit and Nailbuff emphasize that finding Nash equilibrium requires putting yourself in others' shoes. What are their incentives? What are their options? What would you do in their position? Strategic thinking isn't just about optimizing your own position. It's about anticipating others' optimization and responding to it. The chapter concludes with the insight that many frustrating situations, price wars, destructive competition, coordination failures occur because the strategic structure creates perverse incentives. Recognizing the underlying game theory structure helps you understand why these situations occur and how to potentially change the structure to improve outcomes. Part 3. The power of commitment and credibility. One of the most counterintuitive lessons from game theory is that limiting your options can increase your power. Dixit and Nailbuff explain how commitment, binding yourself to a course of action, changes the strategic dynamics in your favor, but only if the commitment is credible. The authors illustrate with the classic example of Cortés burning his ships upon reaching Mexico. By eliminating retreat as an option, Cortés committed his soldiers to fight harder because victory was their only path to survival. This changed the strategic calculation for opposing forces who now faced a desperate enemy rather than one that might retreat. The commitment to fight enhanced Cortés's negotiating position despite, or rather, because of, eliminating an option. In business, commitment takes many forms. Building specialized equipment for a particular customer commits you to serving them, which can strengthen the relationship. They're more confident you won't abandon them because your investment binds you to continue. However, it also puts you at their mercy if they demand concessions. So, commitment is a double-edged sword requiring careful consideration. Dixit and Nailbuff explain that commitment works by changing others' expectations about your behavior. If you credibly commit to retaliate against competitors who enter your market, they're less likely to enter because they believe you'll follow through. But commitment only works if it's credible. If they doubt your willingness to follow through, the commitment is empty. Credibility requires that following through on your commitment must be in your interest once the moment arrives, or that you've made it costly not to follow through. Threats that aren't credible don't deter because others know you won't actually carry them out. The authors distinguish between threats and promises, both of which are forms of commitment. A threat commits you to harm someone if they don't comply. A promise commits you to benefit them if they do comply. Both require credibility. The other party must believe you'll follow through. Making threats credible often requires tying your hands, creating consequences that force you to follow through, even if you'd prefer not to. A company might establish a policy of always pursuing legal action against patent infringement, creating an automatic commitment that's more credible than discretionary threats. Making promises credible requires ensuring you can and will deliver. Escrow accounts, third-party enforcement, reputation concerns, and repeated interactions all enhance promise credibility. In negotiations, the party who can credibly commit first often gains advantage by setting terms others must react to. Dixit and Nailabuf provide the example of labor negotiations. If a union can credibly commit to striking indefinitely, it has leverage. But if management believes the union will eventually accept terms to avoid prolonged hardship, the threat lacks credibility. Each side's negotiating position depends on the credibility of its commitments to hold out. The authors address strategic moves that enhance commitment credibility. Burning bridges, eliminating alternatives, makes commitment credible because you have no choice but to follow through. Building reputation, consistently following through across multiple situations, makes future commitments credible. Establishing automatic triggers, creating systems that enforce commitments without requiring continuous decisions, eliminates discretion that undermines credibility. One particularly powerful form of commitment is pre-commitment through contracts. By legally binding yourself to certain actions, you make those actions credible, even if they wouldn't otherwise be in your interest. Long-term contracts commit parties to continuing relationships, which can enable investments that wouldn't make sense without commitment. Dixit and Nailabuf caution that commitment is dangerous if you're wrong about what you're committing to. Once committed, you lose flexibility to adjust to new information. The company that commits to a technology standard then discovers that standard is inferior, has harmed itself through premature commitment. Commitment should be made cautiously and only when the strategic benefits clearly outweigh the loss of flexibility. The authors also address when to resist others' attempts to commit you. In negotiations, the other side may try to get you to commit early to terms that favor them. Maintaining flexibility allows you to adjust as information emerges and as the negotiation dynamics evolve. The chapter includes practical applications. In parenting, following through on consequences makes future commitments credible. If you threaten consequences but don't enforce them, children learn your threats aren't credible. Consistency creates credibility, which makes future discipline more effective, often without needing to actually enforce consequences, because the threat alone is enough. In business partnerships, credible commitment to invest time and resources makes partners confident in your dedication, encouraging them to reciprocate. But rushing to commit before understanding the partnership's value can trap you in bad situations. Dixit and Nailabuf conclude that commitment is a tool to be used strategically. In some situations, committing early changes dynamics in your favor. In others, maintaining flexibility is more valuable. The strategic thinker recognizes which situations are which and acts accordingly, while also recognizing others' commitment attempts and responding appropriately. Part 4. Cooperation and Competition. Dixit and Nailabuf address one of the most important strategic questions. When should you cooperate and when should you compete? Many situations contain elements of both, and recognizing which dynamic dominates determines your optimal strategy. The authors explain that pure competition, where your gain is another's loss, is relatively rare. Most situations have elements of cooperation where mutual benefit is possible. But many situations also have competitive elements where distributing mutual gains creates conflicts. The strategic challenge is balancing these dynamics. The classic framework is the repeated prisoner's dilemma. In a single interaction, defecting is optimal regardless of what the other does. But In repeated interactions, cooperation becomes viable because future consequences affect current choices. If I betray you today, you'll betray me tomorrow, making us both worse off long term. Dixit and Nailabuff explain that the shadow of the future, how much you value future interactions relative to current ones, determines whether cooperation is sustainable. When the future matters sufficiently, cooperating today to enable future cooperation is rational. When the future doesn't matter much, the relationship is ending, or you're extremely impatient, cooperation collapses. The authors introduce Robert Axelrod's famous computer tournament, where programs playing repeated prisoners' dilemma competed. The winning strategy was tit for tat. Start by cooperating, then do whatever the other player did last. This simple strategy proved remarkably effective. Nice, never defect first. Forgiving, resume cooperation if the other does. But retaliatory, punish defection immediately. Tit for tat succeeds because it establishes cooperation without being exploitable. It cooperates with cooperators, but retaliates against defectors, teaching them that cooperation is the better path. This strategy has applications across business and life. Be cooperative, but not naive. Be willing to retaliate, but don't hold grudges. Dixit and Nailabuff address how to encourage cooperation when the structure creates incentives to defect. Key mechanisms include repeated interaction, creating future consequences; reputation, your behavior in one situation affects others' willingness to cooperate with you elsewhere; contracts, legally enforcing cooperation; monitoring, detecting defection so it can be punished; and changing the payoff structure, rewarding cooperation or punishing defection through rules or norms. In business, cooperation among competitors can increase total industry profit, avoiding price wars, establishing standards, investing in research that benefits all. But cooperation often violates antitrust laws or is difficult to sustain because each firm has incentives to cheat. Understanding what enables and threatens cooperation helps navigate these situations. The authors explain that industries with few firms, repeated interaction, transparency, and similar cost structures tend toward cooperation. Industries with many firms, one-shot interactions, opacity, and varied cost structures tend toward competition. These structural features predict behavior better than assumptions about ethics or personality. Dixit and Nailabuff address when cooperation is inappropriate or impossible. In zero-sum situations, sports, litigation, winner-take-all contests, one person's gain is another's loss, so cooperation isn't an option. In these situations, competitive strategy is appropriate. The mistake is either trying to cooperate in purely competitive situations or competing in situations where cooperation would benefit everyone. The chapter includes applications to negotiations. Most negotiations have cooperative elements. Both parties benefit from reaching agreement. And competitive elements. Distributing gains creates conflict. The best negotiators balance these, building cooperative rapport while also advocating for their interests. Pure competition creates impasses. Naive cooperation leaves value on the table. In organizational settings, cooperation between departments or team members usually increases total value, but competitive dynamics often emerge around credit, resources, or promotions. Leaders who establish structures encouraging cooperation, shared incentives, transparency, long-term relationships, get better outcomes than those whose structures pit people against each other. Dixit and Nail-a-Buff address how to respond when others won't cooperate. Options include punish defection to teach cooperation, find alternative partners, change the structure to make defection less attractive, or accept the competitive situation and optimize accordingly. Which approach works depends on the specific circumstances and power dynamics. The authors emphasize that cooperation isn't weakness and competition isn't strength. They're both tools appropriate for different situations. The strategic thinker recognizes when each approach serves their interests and switches between them as circumstances require. The chapter concludes with Dixit and Nail-a-Buff's insight that many people fail at strategy because they default to either always competing or always cooperating without assessing which approach fits the situation. The art is recognizing the structure of each situation and responding appropriately. Cooperating when mutual benefit is possible and sustainably. Competing when your gain requires another's loss or when cooperation isn't sustainable. Part 5. Strategic use of information. Information is power in strategic situations. But Dixit and Nail-a-Buff explain that how you use information, what you reveal, what you conceal, what you signal, matters as much as what you know. Strategic information management can dramatically shift outcomes in your favor. The authors explain that strategic situations often involve asymmetric information. One party knows something others don't. This creates opportunities and challenges. If you have superior information, you want to exploit it without revealing it. If others have superior information, you want to extract it or protect yourself from exploitation. A classic example is the lemons problem in used car markets. Sellers know car quality, buyers don't. This information asymmetry causes market failure. Buyers assume all cars might be lemons and lower their offers, causing sellers with good cars to exit the market, which confirms buyers' suspicions, creating a downward spiral. Understanding this dynamic explains why certain markets struggle and how mechanisms like warranties and reputation can overcome information problems. Dixit and Nail-a-Buff introduce signaling, actions that credibly reveal information. Expensive signaling works when it's more costly for low-quality parties to mimic than for high-quality parties. A company offering a generous warranty signals confidence in product quality, because offering warranties on bad products would be ruinously expensive. Education serves partly as a signal. The degree signals ability and discipline even beyond what you learned. For signals to work, they must be costly to fake. Cheap signals don't convey information because anyone can mimic them. The peacock's elaborate tail signals fitness precisely because maintaining it requires health. Sick peacocks can't sustain fancy tails. This principle applies broadly. Costly signals are credible. Cheap signals aren't. The authors address screening, mechanisms that cause others to reveal their information. Insurance companies can't directly observe who's risky, so they screen through mechanisms like deductibles. High-risk customers prefer low deductibles they expect to claim. Low-risk customers prefer high deductibles, lower premiums, less likely to claim. Offering both options causes customers to self-sort, revealing information. In negotiations, asking questions is screening. The answers reveal information about others' priorities, constraints, and alternatives. But others may answer strategically, requiring you to interpret carefully. Strategic questioning extracts information that direct questions wouldn't reveal. Dixit and Nail-a-Buff explain that sometimes concealing information is strategic. In auctions, bidders conceal their maximum willingness to pay to avoid paying more than necessary. In negotiations, concealing your reservation price prevents the other side from extracting all surplus. Successful concealment requires controlling not just what you say, but what you signal through behavior, emotion, and circumstantial evidence. The authors address strategic disclosure, choosing when to reveal information. Sometimes, revealing information benefits you by changing others' behavior. Revealing that you have other job offers strengthens your negotiating position with an employer. Revealing your costs might convince a customer their demands are unreasonable, but revealing the same information in other situations weakens you. Revealing desperation for a sale allows buyers to lowball. The rule is, reveal information when doing so moves others toward behavior you prefer. Conceal when revelation would enable exploitation. This requires understanding how others will use revealed information. Dixit and Nailabuff explain reputation as an information tool. Reputation aggregates information about past behavior and signals likely future behavior. A reputation for toughness in negotiations changes how others approach you. They make better initial offers, knowing you won't accept poor terms. But building reputation requires consistency. Occasionally, accepting poor terms to be nice undermines the reputation's value. The chapter addresses deliberate ambiguity and randomization. Sometimes being unpredictable is strategic. In negotiations, strict predictability allows others to exploit your patterns. Occasional unpredictability keeps them guessing. In competitive situations, randomizing moves prevents opponents from exploiting patterns. The tennis player who always serves to the same location gets crushed, but randomizing between options makes them unpredictable. However, Dixit and Nailabuff caution that randomization shouldn't be confused with confusion. Strategic randomization means unpredictability between well-chosen options. Random flailing creates uncertainty without strategic value. The authors provide applications to hiring and evaluation. Interviewees signal through credentials, references, and interview performance. Interviewers screen through questions and assessments. Both parties manage information strategically. Interviewees emphasize strengths and downplay weaknesses. Interviewers probe for hidden information. Understanding this game improves both hiring and job seeking. In investing, information asymmetry creates opportunities and risks. Corporate insiders know more than public investors, creating potential for exploitation. Regulations requiring disclosure reduce information asymmetry, but asymmetry never fully disappears. Successful investors either find information advantages or avoid situations where they're at informational disadvantage. The chapter concludes with Dixit and Nailabuff's framework for strategic information use. Assess what you know that others don't, what others know that you don't, what revealing information would accomplish, what concealing information preserves, how to signal credibly when revelation benefits you, and how to screen others when you need their information. Mastering these dimensions transforms information into strategic advantage. Part 6. Timing, Sequence, and Real-World Applications. In the final sections, Dixit and Nailabuff address how timing and sequence affect strategic outcomes and provide practical frameworks for applying game theory to real business and life situations. The first mover advantage and disadvantage. The authors explain that moving first sometimes confers advantages and sometimes disadvantages. First mover advantage exists when committing early forces others to respond to your terms. Setting industry standards, establishing brand identity, or securing strategic positions before competitors often favors first movers. But first mover disadvantage exists when letting others move first provides information or lets them commit to strategies that limit your options. In negotiations, making the first offer anchors the discussion, but also reveals information. Letting them offer first provides information about their position without revealing yours. Dixit and Nail-a-Buff provide a framework for assessing whether to move first. Move first when commitment has value. It changes how others respond. Early positioning creates advantages, location, standards, relationships, or delay costs more than early commitment. Move second when observing others' moves provides valuable information, maintaining flexibility is important, or others' commitments create opportunities for you. Strategic voting and coalition building. The authors address how game theory explains political and organizational decision-making. In voting situations, strategic voting, voting for a less preferred option to prevent a worse outcome, is rational, but creates distortions. In organizational politics, coalition building determines outcomes more than individual preferences. The median voter theorem explains why political positions cluster in the middle. Candidates need the median voter to win, pulling them toward center positions. Understanding this explains political positioning and predicts how parties position themselves. Bargaining and negotiation. Dixit and Nail-a-Buff provide extensive frameworks for negotiation. Key principles. Understand both parties' BATNAS, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. These determine reservation prices and bargaining power. The party with better alternatives has more power because they need the deal less. Create value before claiming value. Many negotiations have integrative potential, trades that benefit both parties. Discovering these trades expands the pie before fighting over distribution. The best negotiators separate value creation from value claiming, focusing first on enlarging the total and then on fair division. Use objective criteria and precedents to anchor expectations. Arbitrary demands seem like power plays. Demands justified by market rates, comparable deals, or established norms are harder to resist. Manage the negotiation sequence. Sometimes bundling issues creates trades. Sometimes separating them clarifies thinking. Sometimes resolving easy issues first builds momentum. Sometimes resolving hard issues first prevents wasted effort if the deal fails. Auction strategy. The authors explain different auction formats and optimal bidding strategies. In first price sealed bid auctions, bid below your true value by an amount that balances winning probability against paying less. In second price auctions, where winner pays second highest bid, bidding your true value is optimal. You can't improve your outcome by bidding differently. Understanding auction formats explains why sellers choose different mechanisms. Auctions reveal how much buyers value items when sellers don't know. But auctions also allow buyers to pay less than maximum willingness to pay, so sellers must balance information extraction against revenue extraction. Deterring competition. Dixit and Nail-a-Buff address how incumbents deter potential competitors, credible threats to retaliate, price cuts, increased advertising, innovation, deter entry if entrants believe the incumbent will follow through. But threats must be credible. The incumbent must be willing to actually execute them, which requires that retaliation is in the incumbent's interest. Excess capacity signals ability and willingness to increase production if entrants appear, deterring them. Investment in brand, customer relationships, or technology creates advantages that make competing unattractive. But deterrence requires balance. Excessive investment in deterrence wastes resources if competition wasn't likely anyway. Strategic design of incentives. The authors explain how to design contracts and incentive systems that align interests. Key principles. Pay for what you can measure. Make sure measures capture what you actually want. Anticipate gaming of metrics, and balance powered incentives against risk. Stock options align employees with shareholders, but create incentives for short-term stock manipulation. Commissions motivate sales, but may encourage overselling or poor customer service. Understanding these strategic responses helps design better incentive systems. Applying game theory to parenting Dixit and Nailabuf includes surprisingly insightful applications to parenting. Children are strategic agents who respond to incentives. Empty threats teach children that threats aren't credible. Inconsistent consequences create confusion and testing of boundaries. Clear rules, consistently enforced, establish credibility. Commitment to consequences makes discipline more effective and less frequently necessary. Once children believe consequences will follow misbehavior, they behave without needing to experience consequences. This is game theory in action. Credible commitments change behavior. Strategic career decisions. The authors address career strategy through a game theory lens. Develop skills with strategic value. Rare, valuable, difficult to replicate. Build reputation carefully because it affects all future opportunities. Recognize when to compete and when to cooperate with colleagues. Job changes are sequential games with multiple stages. First getting interviews, then getting offers, then negotiating. At each stage, consider how current decisions affect future stages. Accept an interview even if you're unsure about the job, because gathering information has value. But don't waste time on interviews for positions you'd never accept because you're burning bridges. Business strategy applications. The chapter includes numerous business applications. In oligopoly competition, understand that your optimal strategy depends on competitors' strategies. In pricing decisions, recognize that undercutting triggers retaliation. In innovation decisions, consider whether being first is advantageous or whether letting others pioneer while you improve is better. In partnerships, structure agreements, anticipating how circumstances might change and how parties might respond. In mergers and acquisitions, recognize that targets have information advantages and bid accordingly to avoid winner's curse. The limits of game theory. Dixit and Nailbuff acknowledge game theory's limitations. It assumes rationality that real humans don't always exhibit. It requires common knowledge of rationality that doesn't exist. It can't account for all emotional, psychological, and social factors affecting decisions. But they argue that game theory remains invaluable despite limitations. It provides structure for thinking through strategic situations. It reveals hidden dynamics and unexpected consequences. It helps identify where instinct might mislead and where careful analysis pays dividends. Even when predictions don't match perfectly, the thinking process improves decisions. The authors conclude that strategic thinking is a learnable skill. You won't always predict outcomes perfectly, but systematic strategic thinking beats intuition in complex situations. The more you practice seeing situations through a game theory lens, the better your strategic decisions become. We've explored Dixit and Nullabov's complete framework for strategic thinking, looking ahead and reasoning backward to make better decisions, understanding dominant strategies and Nash equilibrium, using commitment and credibility to change strategic dynamics, recognizing when to cooperate and when to compete, managing information strategically, mastering timing and sequence, and applying these principles across business and life. The power of game theory thinking is that it reveals the hidden structure beneath strategic situations. Once you see the structure, behavior that seemed mysterious becomes predictable. Moves that seemed random become purposeful, and your own strategic thinking becomes clearer and more effective. Let's recap the core principles. Look ahead multiple moves and reason backward to find optimal first moves. Identify dominant strategies when they exist and Nash equilibrium when they don't. Use commitment strategically to change others' behavior, but ensure commitments are credible. Balance cooperation and competition based on situation structure. Manage information through strategic revelation, concealment, signaling, and screening. Assess whether moving first or second serves you better, and always think from others' perspectives to anticipate their moves. Here's your challenge. This week, identify one strategic situation you're facing: a negotiation, a competitive situation, a coordination challenge. Map out the game tree. What moves are available to you and others? What responses might follow? What outcomes result? Identify the equilibrium. Where will this situation likely end up if everyone acts strategically? Then, use this analysis to determine your optimal strategy. Strategic thinking doesn't guarantee winning. Sometimes the strategic structure doesn't favor you, and no amount of clever thinking changes that. But strategic thinking prevents unforced errors, reveals opportunities others miss, and improves your odds in every strategic interaction. Over a lifetime, that advantage compounds into significantly better outcomes. If this summary showed you a new way to think about competitive and cooperative situations, let me know in the comments. What insight was most valuable, or what strategic situation you're going to analyze differently? And if you want the complete frameworks with detailed examples, games, and applications, pick up The Art of Strategy by Dixit and Nailbuff. It might change how you see every strategic interaction you encounter. Until next time, remember, life is full of strategic games whether you recognize them or not. The question isn't whether you're playing. It's whether you're playing skillfully or blindly. Master the art of strategy, and you'll play every game better. Thank you for watching.